not questioning an Israeli claim around a hospital means that Israel then goes into that hospital and kills people, human beings. That's the cost. It was very hard as a journalist within those newsrooms to express any dissent, to express any concerns over the coverage. The BBC's job should have been to cover these stories, with the empathetic, humanizing techniques that they usually just reserve for Israelis.
Would you go as far as to say that the BBC as an entity, not individuals as such, are complicit in some of Israel's war crimes?
I mean, these are the real journalists, the Palestinian journalists on the ground, wearing their press vests, knowing that they're very likely to be targeted by Israel. And we have not scratched the surface of what is truly of the crimes Israel has truly committed in Gaza, and one day we will know. If I were to leave this here, is that okay?
It's totally fine. You can put it anywhere. You can even leave it out. Like, I'm not going to be seeing your screen. It's totally fine. Okay, we good, Yasin? You good to go? Hi, good day, and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaaq, Carim, and joining me today is Karishma Patel, formerly at the BBC.
Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you, Karishma. We've spoken on the phone a few times. We're trying to nail this interview down. Karishma left the BBC. How long ago was it again?
Was in October of last year.
Okay, so a long time. It's like more like almost like 6 months ago.
A little while.
And you've recently written that you've left over the impartial coverage, what you feel is the impartial coverage of Israel and Palestine. And you've even called it in a few articles, you've called it kind of an Orwellian space. Just tell me a bit about what that's like.
It's actually very hard to describe. BBC buildings are made of glass. They are meant to communicate transparency, openness, and it's an environment in which you're constantly surveilled, constantly seen. And after October 7th, it became an environment in which it was very hard as a journalist within those newsrooms to express any dissent, to express any concerns over the coverage, to effectively be a good journalist. And a very strange newsroom culture set in where journalists were making their decisions based on fear, based on taking the path of least resistance, based on the potential for mass complaints, for complaint campaigns, based on whether or not they would get told off by, certain editors, certain executives. And they were taking the path of least resistance, essentially, again and again and again. And bad practices sort of ossified into editorial policy, far below editorial standards. And this was the newsroom environment at the BBC, especially in the last few months of 2023.
Okay, so we want to break down all of that and go into it. We're going to go into the nuts and bolts of really what the editorial process was like. I have to caveat this with saying that obviously Karishma is aware that she can get sued, right? So we're not going to be naming people or doing anything like that, but we're going to try to understand for the audience just what that environment was like. We're going to look at examples. We're going to discuss maybe even sort of the pedagogy of journalism, the thoughts that what sort of drove this motivation of kind of what you're speaking about, which sounds awful. It sounds like suppression. It sounds like, complete. It was interesting because when you started off just saying that all the walls and everything's made of glass and transparency. Initially I was like, okay, so that's honest and sincere, but you actually turned it around and how that means that you are seen in some way. It almost made you feel like you didn't have the space to kind of pursue journalism. We talked. You said you have, like, you and colleagues who are not going to name were obviously collecting evidence as such to kind of confront management with. Do you want to go through some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm talking about dossiers of evidence, multiple documents. They're incredibly long, they're incredibly detailed, as you'd expect from, groups of BBC journalists. But when I tell you that the evidence of poor coverage around Gaza is overwhelming, I really mean that. The amount of evidence we have is overwhelming. And It's evidence collected by, corroborated by, a number of academics at this point. So I will, I can talk you through a few of these examples.
Yeah, just a few. I mean, we don't have, you're right, we don't have, it will probably take a few days to go through all of the examples. So we're just going to quickly go through. Yeah.
But one of the key things, and I'm sure this is one of the key things a lot of your listeners will have noticed, by themselves, whether or not they're journalists, is a sort of lack of parity around the terminology used to talk about Israelis versus Palestinians. Phrases like, Palestinians have died, where Israel is omitted as a perpetrator, whereas when we are talking about Israelis, they are killed by accountable actors. And that was something that was incredibly key. And we were making comparisons, plenty of us, because we'd worked on Ukraine, with some of the language used in the coverage around Russia and Ukraine. And over here, for example, I have a comparison that was made to a particular article where it's very clear in the article that Ukrainians were killed by Russian strikes. Now, that phrasing you would not have seen when the BBC was talking about Israeli strikes in Gaza, especially towards the end of 2023. It is the case now that the BBC has been, in some respects, a bit better about that. It has taken an incredibly long time, and a lot of these issues were raised very early on. So it's incredibly disappointing. So that lack of consistency, that lack of editorial consistency, and plenty of examples we have here where you have that sort of that lack of parity in language, died versus killed. And there is an example we have here, in fact, where the word killed was changed to the word died when talking about a Palestinian. Now, these are very nitty-gritty specific things, but they speak to broader applications of language. And these are very specific examples of editorial choices that, as I said, ossified into an overall editorial policy. We were seeing passive language used to describe Palestinians being killed more often than we weren't. And that wasn't a directive. That wasn't something anyone's editor told them to do. It was something a lot of journalists were simply doing because the rest of the BBC was doing it, and choosing to use the active voice, which would, bring clarity to the reporting, which is what we're meant to do, and choosing to include some accountability in that, to say Israeli airstrikes, may have resulted in complaints. And frankly, there were a lot of journalists at the BBC who were making decisions based on that particular fear.
Based on them getting complained about.
Yeah.
You see, I mean, I think I've worked in newsrooms, and I know it's difficult for people to actually understand how these granular things actually make such a big difference to coverage.
I do, yeah.
So sort of, I mean, give us a sense of, to kind of help that process, give us a sense of what your role at the time, when you're talking about the last few months of 2023, was, what your role at the BBC was, and what that role entailed. Like, what were you responsible for? How would your decision making take place, and how were decisions made?
So my job was, so I was a producer at the time. So I had been a newsreader. I was taking a break from doing that, from reading news bulletins, and I was effectively the Middle East specialist on my team. So my job every morning was to look through social media, look at what different aid organizations were saying, what various sources were saying, and then to come to a morning pitch meeting and to tell my team what they should be covering that day, what was important, which angles we could take, which guests, which expert voices we could have on, all of this. So this was my job, and I was doing that day in, day out for many months, focusing on Gaza, obviously seeing all of those unimaginably horrific photos and videos. And obviously this shaped my understanding of what was happening. And it was very clear that I was looking at Israeli war crimes, crimes against humanity. Now, I believe this was lost on the rest of the newsroom.
Now, why is it lost in the rest of the newsroom? Is it a case of they are ignoring it? Is it a case of they don't have access to the same, they're not following the same people you're following on social media, or they're giving less credibility to Al Jazeera journalists who are pointing this out, or they're giving less credibility to the HRW who are pointing this out? I mean, it's a bit ridiculous because it's HRW, it's Amnesty, the evidence is so much, right? But how is it that they just don't see that? Like, is it because they know that if they do, it's as journalists, it's going to be a waste of their time in terms of being able to even if they are passionate about the story and able to sort of manifest that into actual coverage because of their editors or because of their bosses? Like, why? Or is it that they just focused on something else? Like, how is it that there's this massive disparity in BBC, which throughout its various different organizations and different departments has hundreds of journalists?
I can speak to what I saw in my newsroom.
Yep.
As I said, I'd worked on Ukraine. Now, when Russia went into Ukraine, there was an outpour of emotion in the newsroom. There were people very clearly stating that they were shocked. How could this happen? And immediately we saw plenty of humanizing coverage of Ukrainians. Now, the reaction around this, around October 7th and everything afterwards, was entirely different when it came to Palestinians. There was no outpour of grief. There was no outpour of shock. There was around October 7th and around Israelis. There was none of that around Palestinians, not widely anyway. Obviously, journalists like myself and others realized the gravity of what we were seeing, increasingly so as we saw more and more evidence. But as I said, this was lost on most journalists. But it's also, as you mentioned, the fact that lots of the journalists bringing us important information were from Al Jazeera, for example, or they were Palestinian journalists just on the ground, wearing their press vests, filming what was happening right in front of them. And part of the issue with impartiality itself as a concept, and especially the way it's applied by the BBC, is that it involves an over-reliance on quote-unquote authority sources. And by that I mean the government, allies of the government, the police, whatever it may be. These are the sources that sort of shape our coverage. And actually, in this instance, the sources most valuable to the story and the sources giving us the most clarity were, Palestinian journalists on the ground, but they were seen as inherently unreliable, or, perhaps too, quote unquote, biased, which is a term that honestly in newsrooms has turned into a bit of a slur and is sort of weaponized usually against journalists of color who are, in possession of unique access. And that's what these journalists had. And, it's not just that. They're putting their lives on the line. A number of them have now been killed by Israel, targeted. And there was not a lot of respect for that fact either. To the extent that the story of how many Palestinian journalists have been killed by Israel on the ground just hasn't been given the significance in overall BBC coverage that it should have been given. And in fact, at this stage, I'd have expected the corporation to explicitly express its concern for journalists on the ground, because it impacts all of us. Of course it does. It impacts journalism as a whole, the issue of free speech. And I think by now every major news organization should have weighed in.
We're going to speak a lot more about Palestinian journalists who have been killed. And we're going to speak about, I think, the issue of bias and how people who are not white in white spaces, frankly, are treated as emotive and biased and maybe more unreliable, both inside the organization and outside the organization. But let's go back to those last 3 months of of the year 2023. As you are, you're seeing, it's really horrific because I remember doing the same thing. This really horrible footage at a time before Gaza was completely decimated and long before at least 50,000 people were killed. And where there's this fear that it's now 1,000, it's now 2,000 if we don't say anything. As the media, if we don't come out more strongly, and it's not even a case of coming out strongly, just coming out more journalistically accurate, this is gonna really end up quite badly, and it has ended up quite badly. Were there sort of moments that you can trigger moments that you can just think of in terms of the coverage you saw from the BBC that just come to mind, and how did those trigger moments kind of help organize sort of the other journalists who felt that the journalism just wasn't up to scratch, that it was lacking, it was disinformation, it wasn't getting to the heart of contextualizing what's happening in terms of the occupation, in terms of Israel's brutality? Like, just give me a sense of that, both two things, both the triggering moments and then sort of how organizing kind of began to sort of go to management and what that looked like.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of trigger moments. Al-Shifa Hospital comes to mind. And, you know, this was quite early on when Israel hadn't attacked every single hospital in Gaza. And they had claimed that there was a Hamas headquarters underneath Al-Shifa Hospital. And it was a claim taken with gravity by the BBC, by every other major news outlet, despite the fact that Israel is not a reliable source and there was no evidence. Now, it was the case that the BBC actually embedded with the Israeli military and went into that hospital. And I remember that being a very triggering moment for me, because I watched one of our correspondents follow the IDF into this hospital where she was shown, you know, guns near an MRI machine, all sorts. And it wasn't possible to verify where any of that had come from. And that was something that was part of our coverage. And that is why it constantly shocks me, essentially, that people who say they're incredibly concerned about influence on the BBC, you know, for example, around this documentary, you know, lots of concern there around Hamas potentially meddling. That's a claim that's been made. Very little concern over the fact that one of the BBC's own correspondents went into Al-Shifa Hospital as part of an Israeli embed, and our coverage was then subject to the Israeli censor, which I'd say is some rather overt meddling. And I remember watching this unfold and fully understanding the gravity of the fact that Israel made that claim. It was treated with this gravity. It was treated as though it could be true despite no evidence. They then went into that hospital, attacked that hospital, which is a war crime, which is in contravention of international law, and then the BBC followed them in and recorded the quote-unquote evidence they claim to have found there. That entire string of events was absolutely shameful, was not journalism. No work was done there to ascertain the reliability of that claim when it was made. And then we were essentially giving the Israeli military free airtime.
So how does organizing of an event like that, how do you and fellow colleagues, how does that take place? And sort of what's the management reaction to that? Is there embarrassment, for example, whether they're confronted verbally or confronted in a meeting? Like, just how do they deal with that?
I mean, it depends on who you're approaching, and obviously I can't name names for various legal reasons. But there were senior people who didn't react very well to criticism of the coverage, and there were senior people who almost took it personally, that their own, you know, the organization's own journalists working on this story had issues with how it was being covered. But in terms of how it all comes about, it was a very difficult process. As I said, this was an Orwellian environment. And I fully understand the irony of saying that, because Orwell's statue sits outside New Broadcasting House.
maybe it's meant different things to what everyone's intention.
Walk past him often. This was an environment in which, strictly speaking, you could say anything you wanted. You know, if you wanted to criticize something, strictly speaking, you could. Except it was not likely to be received well. it wasn't an open culture in which you could criticize the coverage, come with dossiers of evidence, present it, ask for reasonable editorial change, and then see it happen or have a conversation around how that might be integrated.
What would happen if, I mean, you can't name the people, but just what sort of give me examples of what the responses would be, or how maybe journalists, yourself included, or maybe colleagues that you know, sort of how they were almost self-censoring themselves, or worried that they may not be fired or may not be let go, but it would reflect badly on their progression in terms of their career. Like, just sort of how did that play out?
So we had a number of listening sessions, and a listening session is an arena in which staff members are able to vocalize.
And this is like a broad meeting, a broad open meeting, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I mean, it's a range. It would be a range of staff members, and they'd be speaking to very senior people, vocalizing some of their concerns.
And were these listening sessions, were this specifically because of the Gaza coverage, or are these like things that the BBC does once a month, or were these like reactive because of complaints about Gaza?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. This was specific to the story area, which isn't to say that such meetings haven't happened before around other story areas. I'm not sure. But in this case, yes. And this was something you had to ask for. And what I mean by that is that the BBC didn't have complaint routes for its staff to sort of express any concerns they had without going face to face to, very senior managers. And that was a massive problem. So this is what I mean. It's not an incredibly open environment. There was no inbox set up so the BBC staff could anonymously, let's say, vocalize their complaints. All of these complaint routes were asked for because it was very clear that the coverage was not meeting editorial standards, and not everyone was in a position to go to their immediate editor and express their concerns for various reasons, including the fact that a lot of journalists at the BBC, at other major broadcasters as well, are in a state of precarity. A lot of them are young journalists. They may be on attachments, short-term contracts, and retaining those may be reliant on them keeping a good relationship with their seniors. So there are lots of overlapping factors, and some people were able to be more vocal than others. Now, myself, I was fairly junior. I did become a newsreader, and I did well to become that. But I was fairly junior. Honestly, the calculus of my entire life changed when I saw what I saw coming out of Gaza.
How?
I think for a long time in my career, I had wanted to rise up, in the ranks of the BBC, and, perhaps become a television newsreader, perhaps go down that route, perhaps become a correspondent. I wasn't sure exactly what, but, I had it in my head that I wanted to rise up the ranks, and that this was the place to do public service journalism, which I understand is a little bit naive. But when I saw all of those murdered children on my timeline, and then looked around at my newsroom and understood that none of them wanted to see this, that none of them wanted to do actual journalism and come to evidence-based conclusions around what Israel is doing and then to state them, which is our job. It fully dawned on me that impartiality is just this sort of cloak, and it essentially cloaks all manner of sins, because the BBC will fall foul of even its own editorial standards. It will get complaints from, not only Palestinians, but, various organizations, and it will turn around and say, no, we are being impartial. Because we are angering everyone, we are being impartial. We're representing every single perspective. And in fact, that's not journalism at all, because journalism is about assessing the evidence, coming to conclusions. That's what's useful to the public, in fact. It's not about, evenly airing every single point of view, which is, at the very least, incredibly lazy. Not everything should be subject to a debate format, especially when there are lives on the line. And there have been lives on the line now for, 16 months or so. Prior to that, obviously, as well. But I think the gravity of that was lost on people. The fact that not questioning an Israeli claim around a hospital means that Israel then goes into that hospital and kills people, human beings. That's the cost. That's the cost of all of these news organizations refusing to fully and properly interrogate all of those Israeli claims.
Just coming back to what you say about these listening sessions, do you feel that, you obviously attended them, is there anything that you've raised there that you're willing to share? Did you feel self-censored? Were you self-censoring yourself when you were there because you were concerned that there'll be sort of implications? Do you know of other colleagues who definitely wanted to say something and were all excited about the meeting but then didn't? Without naming names again, can you just give me anecdotally just kind of a sense of what that's like in real terms, what that pressure is like, and as you meet, as you go into the session, maybe with hopes of saying something, but then maybe not articulating yourself as well as you could because of, again, your own fear, but also the fears of others.
I will say that I think I articulated myself as I wanted to. But
awesome. What did you articulate, if you don't mind? If you can remember.
Issues around the style guide. I remember articulating those. Inaccuracies in our style guide. Issues around the kind of language in our style guide that was then being reproduced. But that was one of many things that I raised during the course of, over a year. As for others, there were plenty of people who had concerns but were afraid to vocalize them. Plenty of people who contributed in other ways to making the coverage better. But I think what happened was that every journalist who could see what was happening had to look themselves in the mirror and consider how far they wanted to go. And there are plenty of people who've been incredibly brave inside those buildings. Nobody will know who they are. I know who they are. They do exist. And they are still doing good work. And I, for one, am very pleased that they are still there. Not everybody should do what I'm doing. Because the BBC continues to be incredibly powerful. It has, there are millions and millions of eyes on that webpage every single day. And that will still be the case, whether or not I'm talking. But I do think it's important for the public to understand that there is dissent within those walls. It's not easy. And there are sacrifices that you do invariably end up making. But I think it was, even if we felt that we wouldn't get the editorial concessions that we wanted to get, it was always going to be worth having on the record that we tried and that we cared and that we could see that Palestinians were being killed by Israel and that our coverage was just woefully inadequate at best. And so there is a record of that.
Can you give me examples of the style guide changes that you specifically articulated and wanted and sort of raised?
I believe one of the things we raised was around the use of the word occupied and the inconsistency in its usage across our coverage. So it might be the case that one correspondent talked about the occupied West Bank, but perhaps another wouldn't, and perhaps online it looked different. And that, for example, was one of our editorial asks. It's quite reasonable.
It's internationally recognized as occupied and has been by the UN for decades. So,
exactly. Yeah. But as in that was part of a sort of broader ask to incorporate international law properly into our coverage. So that's one example. But for example, a sort of more recent example is the fact that there is an ICC arrest warrant out for Netanyahu, but that context doesn't seem to accompany any mention of him on the BBC. It should accompany every mention of him on the BBC. It should be the case that they talk about Netanyahu, who's wanted under this ICC arrest warrant, and a little bit of context around that is crucial. or the ICJ ruling in January. I think there are a number of people internally who are concerned about the fact that, firstly, when that was covered, when the case itself was covered, South Africa's case didn't get as much airtime. Following that, it was not incorporated into coverage as legal context. And it should have been in every single article about, not enough aid, not enough food being allowed into Gaza. And in fact, actually, just every single article about Gaza should have had a line in there talking about the ICJ ruling. And I'm talking about a sentence here. It doesn't take up much space. And once again, that's something that's easily implementable. So it's a line that management can feed down. It's a line that they can decide on in terms of the wording, but it should be there to give our audiences clarity and for them to understand the gravity of what's happening. Because otherwise, honestly, I think a lot of the public will sit there and assume that either Israel is justified in what it's doing, well, not all, that Israel is justified in what it's doing, but also that it's only, Palestinians on the ground who are complaining about this, which is absurd.
Is there a sense of embarrassment from some of, you don't have to speak specifically, but just from BBC leadership, that you have Israeli leaders on record saying we are starving the Palestinians. We are doing this because we want concessions in our negotiations. We will cut off the water. We will. It's being said repeatedly. It's not just from Yoav Gallant. It's said by various leaders. It's said by various settler leaders, and sometimes worse is said. Is there a level of embarrassment when that's been happening, but the BBC then fails to acknowledge that that's happening, or fails in their writing to say that this starvation is intentional? It has changed, you're right, recently in the last 2 months, but not by much, but sort of where it's almost like maybe possible. But is there a sense of embarrassment? This would be embarrassing? No? Should it not be embarrassing?
Oh, I put that. I have put that to people internally.
And what was their response? What's their face like? Forget about their response. Do they even look bothered by this, or do they just?
They tend to sort of balk at it. There are plenty of people internally who I think are still convinced that the BBC's coverage has been entirely fair. And they remain convinced of that. Is that
just ballpark? Is that 50% of the staff, 60%, 80%? Is it a small, what do you think? Just, I get there's no accuracy here. This is just you taking a temperature.
Of course. I honestly think that it's a hard thing to gauge because there are some very senior people who, solidly believe that. There are other journalists across the organization who simply don't care enough to have a strong opinion on it or to have made a strong assessment around it. And I think that is almost the worst thing, because many journalists were pulled onto this story. Nobody expected Israel's bombardment to go on for so long. So many journalists were pulled onto it. And of all of those journalists, as far as I can tell, not many then went to the effort of kind of educating themselves on, the history, the context, on what was actually going on. So that to me is the more troubling aspect. But just to go back and touch on what you were saying about Israeli officials coming on air, because there are so many examples I have of a correspondent, a correspondent out in Jerusalem in a linen shirt, interviewing an Israeli representative of some sort. And this representative says something along the lines of, we're doing everything we can to protect civilians. And the correspondent invariably says nothing to that.
Just nods along.
Yeah, nothing, no pushback. And that's very easy pushback because there are numbers that will show.
There's literally numbers every day. 65 people, for example, were killed yesterday.
Exactly. It's not a difficult thing to do. The lack of willingness to do it.
What makes them not answer the question? Is it because they're going to get reprimanded from their bosses? Is it because, these correspondents, and again, not being specific, just kind of don't know, which I find hard to believe? Is it because they, what's the reason? Why would they not ask that question?
I think it is editorial cowardice.
So if they did continue asking these questions, do you think they'd be pulled off air eventually? Do you think they'd be what do you think would be the pathway?
Well, I can't speak to that exactly, but I imagine it can make your life quite difficult if you become known as the presenter or correspondent who gives robust interviews, who conducts robust interviews with Israeli officials. But the thing is that anyone would be, these presenters, correspondents, all of us are far more insulated if editorial policy is better across the board, if the people at the top issue editorial edicts to say that, when these sorts of claims are made, can we please make sure that we push back appropriately with the evidence, with the facts, with what experts are saying. And that sort of thing insulates everyone, and it creates an editorially brave newsroom environment. And it means that people are able to continue to do their jobs without looking over their shoulders, without worrying that a complaint campaign might mean that the BBC has to issue an apology. I mean, very recently, we saw that a producer at BBC World Service had texted somebody at the Israeli embassy to ask for a particular guest who might be critical of Netanyahu, an Israeli military guest. And the BBC turned around and apologized for that. And that is creating a newsroom environment in which your producers are afraid to do their work, to do their jobs. Because there might be, it might be a bit of an odd choice to text somebody from the Israeli embassy with that particular request. But it is not strange for a journalist to seek out a particular voice to fill a particular gap in coverage. That is what we were doing often. And I don't know to what extent people at the top realize the damage that they're doing to all of the journalists who work under them when they create an environment like that. Because now everybody working on this story who's seen that is going to be, they're just going to be quivering with fear in terms of doing their jobs.
You earlier mentioned the ICJ case and how the BBC, they actually failed to cover the entire South African sort of delegation's arguments live, and then they covered Israel's almost verbatim. But just on the whole, dealing with the word genocide over this you haven't been there for the last sort of 5 or 6 months, but when you were there, how did people deal with the word genocide? Is it just something that they just ignored? Was it ever raised that, hey, maybe we should be thinking about what we're going to call this, that even if we don't call it a genocide, we need to caveat it with the fact that Israel is under trial for genocide to some extent? How did they deal with that?
They didn't deal with that.
Just ignored?
They did not deal with the word genocide, with the concept itself. It rarely appeared in any of our coverage, and when it did, in the form of a guest, whether this was a Palestinian guest, an expert of some sort, the presenter speaking to them would sort of panic and call it a controversial term or talk about Israel's response to it and therefore just shut the conversation down. That was how the word genocide was treated in our coverage. And what we needed to see after the ICJ ruling was an open, transparent, responsible incorporation of the word genocide into our coverage. Because a sort of legal bar had been met. This should have been a turning point editorially for all of the change makers at the BBC to sit down and say, right, how do we responsibly bring this into coverage? What are we telling our correspondents, our presenters to say when somebody accuses Israel of genocide, considering the fact that we had this ICJ ruling? Now, that wasn't a conversation they decided to have at the beginning of 2024. And instead, you had mass avoidance of the term, of any reasonable engagement with the term. And so you had this sort of black hole in the coverage. And I think I've been talking recently about a sort of an accountability hole at the heart of the Gaza coverage. Because, as I said, for months and months, Israel's claims were treated as reliable. Israel as perpetrator of anything was sort of left out of headlines. It became this ghostly presence committing war crimes without actually being named or looked at. And then this word genocide was treated in the same way. It was avoided, it was worked around, it was shut down whenever it did come up. And I mean, that to me is incredibly Orwellian. There was a reasonable way to engage with that term. It's not, it's not a slur. It has a very specific legal definition. And the general public watching BBC News should have been given access to good coverage around the concept of genocide. And I'm talking about legal experts, experts in genocide and crimes against humanity, many of whom have been talking about it for months and months and months. The Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention, for example, had multiple red warnings out. So the fact that none of this could be found in BBC coverage was a massive abdication of responsibility, and is very far from public service journalism.
I want to start getting to sort of, and again, this is speculative, but just sort of what's at the heart of this. And I'm just before that, I'm just gonna rant a bit, right? But so at least 50,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza. This is what the Gaza Health Ministry has said, I think, just 2 days ago. The Lancet, like almost a year ago, or like it was 9 months ago, said that they believe that in a letter, in a sort of a letter, not a report, not in-depth study, just a letter, said that the number is probably close to 185,000 when they count indirect deaths and everything else. Just, covering this daily and looking at the starvation, looking at the hampering of people's lives, we don't know the number. And honestly, I don't think it's far-fetched to say it's maybe 300,000, 250,000. It's pretty ridiculous. What we do know from Google Maps and from other studies, it's like 85% of all the buildings have been destroyed. Every single hospital has been bombed to some extent or completely destroyed. All the schools, all the universities, people are living in tents. Right now, it's been 22 days since Israel had let in any food, water, electricity. It's strange that the public broadcaster of a state like the UK isn't even having a discussion about whether this is genocide. It's pretty august, right? Now, like, honestly, even a year ago, knowing the biases of the BBC, I would have thought that by now they'd be discussing something along those lines, but it's still not there. And if anything, while some coverage is improving because the story is going on for longer, and it's partly because the story is going on for longer, there's more mute discussions anyway about this, and it's like moving on now, right? What's driving this? Is it the fear of complaints? Is it sort of racism within the BBC, anti-imperial, like imperial sort of legacy and thinking? Like, in your own assessment, just what drives this absolute carelessness? I wouldn't even say it's careless. It's almost intentional bias and disinformation as opposed to careless misinformation. What's driving it?
I think it's a combination of different things. So it is, as you said, racism to an extent. What we are very clearly seeing in the language, in some of the examples I've mentioned, but also the fact that, terms like massacre and atrocity and horrific war crime are reserved for
non-white people.
Precisely, yeah. There's a very clear hierarchization of lives there. And, it was in drastic comparison with Russia, Ukraine. And I worked on both and I could see the difference. It was palpable. So it is that. It's also this fear of complaints. Fear of, for example, the Israeli embassy turning around and sending your text to whoever to complain about you. It's that, but also sort of mass complaint campaigns. Certain journalists have been targeted by certain organizations for working on Gaza or for being seen to be biased. So it's that. And then it is something I've touched on, which is this over-reliance on authority sources and seeing that as journalism. In fact, obviously, being a good journalist is incredibly backbreaking work, and it's about finding your best sources of information so that they corroborate each other. You paint a picture, you get adequate context, you investigate, you do all of these things. And in fact, at the BBC, what so many people seem to just be doing, like a reflex, was relying on these very powerful sources that they felt had authority.
I mean, it's just, I mean, because this is a bit of journalistic speak to the audience. I mean, authority sources meaning government officials, people close to. I mean, and that is stenography. I mean, the nature of spokespeople speaking on behalf of an entity, or is the fact that they are going to do PR. And it's ridiculous that they are seen. I wouldn't even call them sources. I would say that this is an argument being put forth by the people representing those people. So I mean, there's absolutely a over-reliance to that, and I think it's not just a BBC problem. It's a problem with it's the way people perceive others. The minute it's the authority source of people we otherize, then it's not reliable. Then it needs to be investigated. Then it needs to be looked at. Quite literally, even if we have pictures of children who are being bombed, it still needs to be kind of corroborated, but not the other way around.
Well, I was going to say that a good example of this, and how you'll see it in the language, is that whenever Palestinians say something, the word allege is always in there. They allege this, they allege they've experienced this. And there are multiple examples where an Israeli source had said something and there may just be a colon and then what they've said. Or you'll see the phrase, XYZ tells of something. And right there you can see this over-reliance on, yes, authority sources, which is, as you've said, just stenography.
I mean, the other thing is, and I mean, I think you've kind of addressed this, but every single crime that Israel commits the crime is not committed, or not mentioned. What's mentioned is Israel's right to defend itself. So someone has said something, they said that, just bear in mind, Israel has a right to defend itself.
Well, this was another very shocking part of the BBC's coverage, because almost every single presenter has said that in response to allegations around
to anyone.
Israel.
Response to like Human Rights Watch, who they probably don't interview much anymore, would just come on and say, this is what our reports find. Bear in mind, I mean, which is really the job of the Israeli government.
No, I know, and
yes.
They say it, and at this point they've just internalized what Israel would say, which is incredibly concerning, because actually, as a journalist, if you want to go to Israel for right of reply and incorporate that into coverage, you're very welcome to. But vocalizing what you think they would say without them even being present is absolutely bizarre editorial practice, but also incredibly damaging, because I mean, everybody can see how the BBC looks when it's doing that. Because that's a presenter, apropos of nothing, just coming out with what they think Israel might say. But actually with that, I never saw a written directive to incorporate that into coverage to the extent we saw it. So I never saw an email or anything in the editorial guidelines to say when this sort of allegation is made against Israel, this should be your response. And that to me is terrifying, because this is a really good example of editorial fear ossifying, sort of hardening into an editorial policy.
The narrative. It's exactly what Orwellian spoke about with terms of newspeak. It becomes part of the language and the way we think. You mentioned Palestinian journalists. Last night, Hassam Shabat, who's a journalist for Al Jazeera, was killed. I want to read a tweet that he actually wrote about. It's probably mid-April, so it's almost 11 months ago. And he says, before this genocide started, I was a young college student studying journalism. Little did I know I would be given one of the hardest jobs in the world, to cover the genocide of my own people. After 193 days, I have lost close to 100 people from friends and family that I know of. I have lost my house the very first day. I have lost about 23 kilograms. I have lost my city. I have lost myself. It's like the young man once full of life is all gone, and I have aged 100 years. Now, Hassam was killed about 24 hours ago by Israel. This is another Palestinian journalist, Hassan Hamad. He was killed about 3 months ago, and this is what a friend wrote about him on Twitter. Hassan, we will certainly never forget Hassan and the look in Hassan's eyes. His eyes that blamed the world and reflected sadness and carried the determination of his heart. I always looked at his picture and talked to it as if I was talking to him, telling him, young man, how can you carry the flag of journalism? But every day he proved that he was worthy of it, patient, brave, and daring. When you consider these journalists and you think about some of your bosses, what's your thoughts?
I mean, these are the real journalists. the Palestinian journalists on the ground wearing their press vests, knowing that they're very likely to be targeted by Israel. You know, that their entire families could get killed. Many of them have explicit threats made against them. These people are essentially the best of us. They are the gold standard of journalists. And for any of them to have been treated like unreliable sources when they are filming their own genocide there actually isn't a word. There actually isn't a word for what that is. It's just it's absolutely abysmal. And also the fact that we haven't seen coverage at the BBC commensurate with the gravity of the fact that so many journalists have been killed just for doing their jobs. And then Israel turns around and claims that they are terrorists, claims whatever it wants. And in fact, the BBC's job should have been to cover these stories, you know, with the empathetic, humanizing techniques that they usually just reserve for Israelis. They should have been covering these stories. And then when Israel makes those claims, they should have been interrogating those claims, and they should have been getting to the heart of what had actually happened. But that's not what we've been seeing the BBC do. And in terms of what I'd say to senior people at my organization, I would ask them how they look in the mirror, or how they could possibly call themselves journalists. Not that many of them in the executive even are journalists. But I honestly just feel very deeply ashamed of our public broadcaster. It has not served the public here. It has not served Palestinians here and in Gaza and in the occupied West Bank. It has served the state of Israel very well.
Would you go as far as to say that the BBC as an entity, not individuals as such, are complicit in some of Israel's war crimes?
I would. I understand that it's a sort of legally difficult claim to make. So I can't speak to how that would hold up in a court of law. What I can say in terms of my analysis is that people are expecting somewhere like Israeli Channel 13 to give airtime to somebody making explicitly genocidal, expressing genocidal intent. And we expect it from a channel like that. And we know not to trust it necessarily. But what the BBC has been doing is far more dangerous, because they will give airtime, or they have given plenty of airtime to Israeli officials expressing genocidal intent, and they have not pushed back enough. And what that communicates to the public is that these are reasonable things for Israel to do, that it is reasonable of Israel to violate international law again and again and again. That's what they're communicating to the public, to Israel itself, to the government, because everybody knows that the BBC has the power to hold our own government to account if it wants to potentially push, not explicitly, but to sort of hold the government accountable so that there's policy change. And actually, the BBC's job should have been, over these past 16 months or so, to empower the public with the robust evidence-based conclusions, with the facts, for them to go and make their own informed decisions around what they need to do next. Because I think if the public was made aware as early as possible of what all of the evidence was saying, perhaps more people would have been on the street. I don't know. But the BBC has a massive responsibility, and it has not lived up to it at all.
Earlier on, you mentioned that in a big way, the way that BBC has covered Gaza has impacted your entire career and has changed the course of, you saw yourself as becoming sort of a senior anchor at the BBC, and now that's not the case. When you did, why? I mean, was this always your goal when you joined the BBC? Was it to be a senior journalist and a sort of a reporter and anchor? What was your aspirations when you joined the BBC?
Well, initially I just joined the BBC because I wanted to do public service journalism. I just had recently finished my master's at Cambridge, but it was in English. It wasn't journalism, and I'd half expected just to do a PhD, but instead I thought, you know what? No, I want to go and do this sort of work. I want to be a journalist, and there's this sort of noble. There is something noble about public service. Or the idea that you don't go and work for a private corporation, you go and work somewhere where you're not likely to get paid as much as you would somewhere else. But, it's for the public. There aren't a bunch of advertisements. You aren't beholden to corporate actors. You're hoping that there might be some independence there. Now, of course, the government holds the BBC's purse strings, and there is a very different kind of control going on there. But I stepped into the BBC with those thoughts, essentially. And at that point, I didn't know exactly what I was going to become, but I understood that I wanted to do a sort of accountability-driven, people-centered journalism. And that's what I was working towards. That's what I hope I've done in the time that I was there. And, there were concerns I already had. There were times where I was reading news bulletins, and there would be a line in my news bulletin about X number of migrants crossing the channel in small boats. I was already quite close to leaving over that sort of coverage because
they're refugees, not migrants.
Yeah, well, it was all deeply dehumanizing. Okay. The BBC's migration coverage revolves around constantly tallying small boats. And the BBC's failed to engage with the core issues that mean anyone might attempt that crossing. And it was already the case that in reading those news bulletins, I felt deeply ashamed at how dehumanizing they were, and I understood that I didn't want to be the face of this, that I didn't want these words coming out of my mouth. And especially in covering Gaza, I realized that I would never want to be in a position
where your face is attached to the coverage.
Yeah, and I'm reading something from a teleprompter that, frankly, makes me feel sick because of how dehumanizing it is. And I understood that I didn't want to be in that position. I had already felt that over the migration coverage, because it has always dawned on me. I have always understood that when we are talking about small boats, we're talking about human beings, asylum seekers, and that was lost in the coverage. And some of those techniques did sort of filter over to the Gaza coverage, some of those dehumanizing linguistic techniques. But I think Gaza is essentially what broke me. There's so many at this point instances of the coverage failing to communicate the gravity of what's happening, or failing to communicate what's happening at all. And what else is it that we expect from our public broadcaster? We're all actually paying for it. And if they're not telling us, if they don't have the editorial bravery to tell us what's happening on the ground and to hold certain actors accountable, honestly, the BBC is no use to us.
Were there moments in your career previously when you worked with the BBC where you were proud of the organization?
Yeah, I mean, there have actually been moments of that even over the past 16 months. What I'm going to call isolated examples of very good coverage, of people-centered coverage that attempts to get to some accountability, that uses all of those techniques of investigation to actually come to those conclusions. And that's because there are really good journalists at the BBC. And some of them have simply made the choice to stay because they want to try to do good work where they can, and they want to use the massive platform that the BBC is to try to do that. So it is not the case that, you know, the coverage is all bad. It's more that there are systemic issues, and that if you find yourself in contravention of some of these sort of editorial policies that have sort of set in, you know, you may find life very hard in the BBC, even if you are managing to get really good work through. I think it's exhausting for a lot of people.
What do you think when you think of everything that you've been through personally in the last sort of 16 months, the coverage you've seen? What's like sort of the one thing you think you've learned about the world and yourself?
I think I've learned that I'm much braver than even I thought I was. But I think that that's because I was watching all of these journalists on the ground in Gaza putting their lives on the line. And I didn't understand how I could do anything. As in, I understood that what I would have to do in order to be seen as brave was so much less than that. You know, nobody's going to necessarily come after me and my family and threaten me with an airstrike on my own home. This is what these journalists are facing every day. I think the very least I could do is speak out about what I've seen, in the hopes that, you know, some of these major broadcasters think twice and exhibit a bit of editorial bravery. But as I said, I think seeing all of these things completely changed my understanding of what a journalist is, because a lot of people, you know, there are people who are critical of me and who say, well, look at all of the things she's saying now. She's simply biased. You know, she was never able to do her job. She's incapable of impartiality. Now, I could trouble all of those concepts, obviously. But it's not the case that I'm biased. It's the case that I saw so much evidence that I've come to such clear conclusions. And I'm now driven by those conclusions. And I am driven to do whatever I can to illuminate others around what those conclusions are, because I'm a journalist and I've done my job and I know what I'm talking about. But it's also to attempt wherever I can to actually do something, you know, which is why I'm doing fundraising for a children's charity in Gaza, for example. But I know what I've seen, and I'm following it through.
What are you doing now, and what are you busy with?
So I'm getting a lot of my thoughts down in a book, and it will be a book on how impartiality doesn't work for a lot of the reasons I've spoken about today. But it will also be about my experiences, a lot of the things that I've seen, and this journey I essentially made from being a BBC newsreader and journalist to speaking out, to being someone who is very openly fundraising for a children's charity in Gaza, but, you know, my movement from one point to another. But I want people to understand that they should have been moved by everything that they've seen over the past however many months, that it probably should have changed the course of your life. And if it didn't, maybe you should question why.
As part of the fundraising, I think you are now a finalist for Miss Great Britain?
Miss Universe Great Britain.
Miss Universe Great Britain, there we go. Firstly, congratulations, but how's that been?
Yeah, it's been wonderful. It's been a really wonderful platform, and it's a slightly unorthodox thing to do, which I understand, but it's all about fundraising, and it's all about highlighting causes you care about. So I've been using that platform to fundraise for Gaza Great Minds. They're a charity operating tent schools in Gaza to a very high standard. And they do art therapy with the children because they've all obviously experienced quite a bit of trauma. They feed them, clothe them, do things with the parents, have sort of fun days where these children can laugh a bit. And they have given them a sense of hope and future. And it's it's basically an invaluable gift to be able to fundraise for them at all. So I wanted to use the platform to do something good. And like I said, all of this is just an extension of the fact that I know exactly what I've seen happening on the ground, and I understand the extent to which these children need all of the donations that they can get. So I am doing my part.
Best of luck with all that. Just the last question. It's a two-parted question, because I always like to ask many questions. Sure. But how do you think history will judge the BBC's coverage of this? And where do you think the BBC will be in a decade or so?
Yeah, I mean, there's that saying around journalistic coverage, which is that history is watching. And it is up to the journalist to understand while things are unfolding the potential gravity of what they're seeing, which is why we all need to attempt to be good journalists, whatever it is that we're covering. Now, I don't think the BBC will be judged well for what it's done. I think it will be, along with many other news outlets, including, let's say, the New York Times, it will be seen as an organization that could have done something to educate the public, to put pressure on, on our government and on Israel, but didn't. For a myriad of reasons, chose not to do that, and chose instead to use its considerable powers, its considerable sort of legitimizing powers, to make Israel's justifications seem reasonable. And history won't, posterity won't judge that well. Because at some point, plenty of external people are going to have access to Gaza, and they will go in. It is already the case that during the ceasefire period, which was constantly violated by Israel, but ceasefire period, people were going back to certain sites where we know there were mass killings, and they are finding, bones and skulls and bodies, essentially. And we have not scratched the surface of what has truly, of the crimes Israel has truly committed in Gaza. And one day we will know. And one day we will know. Well, you were saying before that, the number of people killed could be, around 300,000. Right now, there are so many people trapped under the rubble. We don't know how many. Eventually, there will be a number, and it will be much bigger than any of the numbers being spoken about. And the true gravity of everything will be incredibly clear, and the extent to which that differs from, let's say, the BBC's coverage will be starkly clear.
And then the last part, where do you think that the BBC would be like a decade or so, or like in the future? It doesn't have to be a decade, 20 years from now. Where do you see them going?
I mean, public trust has been eroded to a massive extent. It was already the case that the BBC was hemorrhaging younger audiences, diverse audiences. I think over the past 16 months or so, they have further lost those audiences, who are now turning to, alternative news outlets, Declassified, Dropsite, Zeteo, you name it. These exist now. There's a whole other news landscape, and there are lots of people who will be going there for their news who may otherwise have gone to the BBC because they respect this idea of public service journalism. They've lost that respect on a massive scale. There are lots of members of the public even who wouldn't necessarily be keeping up with the news in the Middle East, but because Israel has been attacking Gaza for so long, even they are paying attention to a certain extent, and even they are, are sort of feeling at odds with the BBC's coverage. So I think the true extent of this is something that the BBC itself doesn't understand. And I'm not sure that it will exist in its current form in 10 years. I think that, the people at the top are eroding all of the things about the BBC that would have meant the coverage around Gaza would have been better. And I think the BBC has failed to understand what public service journalism means, because I think it is about, people and community-centered, accountability-driven, solutions-focused journalism. That's what it is. That's what differentiates it from, let's say, corporate journalism. It's failed to do that, and it's gutting all of its local services, and it is essentially eroding a lot of the sort of more humanizing elements of the journalism operation there. So I don't see it going in a good direction. I'm concerned about the future of our public broadcaster. And, it needs to be in better hands. There need to be working journalists at the top of that organization. It is not the case currently.
Thank you so much for your time.